One of the tough things about running this channel is that I have content that's from around the horror genre, which sounds like a good thing, but in reality, the people who enjoy the content about books don't always enjoy deep dives into exploitation cinema, and the movie people sometimes don't want to hear about books at all. So that leaves me in a place because I love all these things. My bio on my books talks about yellow spine paperbacks, black and white monster movies, and the Thunder Lizard backbeat of rock and roll, which, if you look over my shoulder, you see is also a passion of mine. So putting together content for the channel, I always have to balance to make sure that everyone kind of is getting a little bit of what they want, but at the same rate, it's my channel. I can be selfish about it. I can talk about what I like. That balance, at least in my headspace, is one that sometimes I don't do very well. So today, hopefully I can hit both sweet spots and get both audiences on board, because what we're going to talk about is the slasher subgenre. Now, not everyone loves slashers, not everyone likes slasher movies, but increasingly the nostalgia for the golden era of the slasher has only grown. There was a point where the slasher was pretty dead and fans were pretty burnt out. From about 1986 till about 1996, there was about 10 years where every attempt to bring life back to the slasher subgenre was met with just indifference or hostility by horror fans who just couldn't seem to escape guys with pointy metal blades and white masks. They wanted a breather. And that breather unfortunately affected the whole genre. As a commercial art, the distributors took the lack of interest in new slasher properties mean that people didn't want new horror. And when they did bring things out, like an adaptation of Dean Koontz's Phantoms to the big screen, often those films were just pretty awful. That didn't help it, and that led to the great horror drought of the 90s. I'm going to do a video on that soon, because it's a subject that I think deserves to be put in a proper context, and I just don't see it being done. In the meantime, let's take a look back at the slasher subgenre and feature a very important missing link in the evolution that I think you'll find very interesting and hopefully might scratch an itch for both the readers and the film fans out there. So the very first part of slasher media is actually not fiction. When you look at the coverage of the Jack the Ripper murders, they were written very much in a kind of breathless exploitation novel mode. They read like fiction, and all the most garish aspects are emphasized. You have all the elements of the modern slasher, of course. You have the stalking of women. You have a certain moralism with prostitutes being the main victims of the killer. You have the police procedural in place, leading nowhere. The killer's always a step ahead. You have the taunting letters. So that's the modern Freddy Krueger thing, right? Like that attitude of that swagger. That is Michael Myers cocking his head to the left, Jason Voorhees throwing down the spear gun, or, of course, Freddy just spitting out a one-liner. But the Jack the Ripper coverage actually was full of embellishments. There was lots of stuff that was reported that was absolutely untrue. So when I say it's nonfiction, that might be a slight exaggeration. I think a lot of it was fiction. The letters might have been fiction, for that matter. We have really not much way outside of one particular instance to know that they absolutely were legitimate. So I think that after reading the accounts of the Ripper's murders for an extended period of time, readers both in obviously England but also in America kind of got a taste for that kind of hard-edged crime. And you can see it today, of course, how many channels are devoted to pretty much just murder documentaries. Do a quick YouTube search for murder doc, and you can lose yourself for months and never revisit the same case, probably. There's entire channels dedicated to just this issue. I subscribe to some of them. Some of them are great people that cover this stuff. There was a gap there. Certainly, you have the Holmes murders, and the coverage there is pretty on label for the modern slasher as well. But really, it's not until we get up to Robert Bloch's Psycho being released, which is about the Gein murders, but really only took the disturbing aspects of the case. It's not a biography at all of Gein in any sense. But that novel opened the floodgates. It's not a slasher novel, just like the movie's not purely slasher. I like the term proto-slasher for Psycho a lot. All the elements are there, but it's concerned with other things that were important to storytelling at the time that later on wouldn't be. I don't think that we'd really have the moral crisis at the beginning about stealing from the bank in a modern slasher. It's not important to modern cinema. But it was very important at that time to set up a reason why Mary Crane, or Marion Crane, depending on the book or movie, why she can't just reach out to the police for help at any point. Why is she hiding? Why is she kind of on this dead-end mission? The result is a book and a movie that have all the elements of slasher, but don't completely close the circle. However, Psycho was really popular with readers, and Hollywood took note. They made a film that made the psychodrama incredibly popular, and ripoffs in film, like Straight Jacket, for instance, were plentiful. In literature, it happened too, and that's not really well known. But there was a lot of cheap paperbacks put out in the wake of Psycho, both the book and the film, to capitalize on that success. That's a thing that's well worn in the horror genre, going back as old as we can. Now, you can argue about a lot of these books, because a lot of them are clearly proto-slashers as well. They have elements, but not all the elements. They don't have the marketing, or they do have the marketing, but the book is completely different, sometimes retitled just to be a little bit more exploitative as a title to get the Psycho audience to read a book that otherwise they wouldn't read. But there's one book in particular that you cannot cut anyway. This is probably the most important unrecognized link between Psycho and Black Christmas and Halloween, right? And it's a book called The Slasher by Ovid Demaris. The tagline to this book is, "Somewhere a killer smiled as he stalked his next victim." You have to remember that in 1959, the date of the publication of this book, the movie Psycho was not out yet. It remained in print for many years in the same edition, and it did very well for a paperback original. It did so because of its shocking similarities as far as its marketing to Psycho. But I'm going to read you the description of the book from the back, and then I'm going to read you the blurb inside the book, both which read very much of their time. We'd never market books this way now. And I want you to think about, well, the slasher genre. And I think you'll see that this clearly paved much of the familiar road that the Friday the 13th, the Dorm That Dripped Blood, The Burning, all those films would really calcify into what we really think of as the hard slasher rules that many years later Scream would make into a punchline. Here's the back cover of the slasher's description of the book. Lieutenant Sam Johnson sat listening impatiently as the police psychologist spoke. "I'm afraid we're dealing with another sex crime. There's no question about it. Think of how the bodies were mutilated. Also, this killer will strike without reason or motive, and he will strike again and again until his morbid sexual desires are satisfied." Lieutenant Johnson, the most experienced detective on the force, leaned forward. "And I'll tell you something, Doctor," he said. "We know this man is big and powerful. We know he's an expert with a knife. But that's all we know. A madman on the loose in The Slasher." That is absolutely all the exploitation elements. That scene could be in Black Christmas verbatim. It could be in Halloween without a change, really. I mean, if I had said, If I just changed the roles a little bit and said Loomis said and Sheriff Brackett said, you would be convinced that this was the Halloween novelization from that description. But it's not. So inside the cover, the very common time, there'd be an excerpt from later in the book as a selling point. In bookstores, people would open, or in more common cases, at the spinner racks at the end of their supermarkets, people would pull this paperbacks off the rack and they would read the blurb to get a feeling for the writing itself, and get a little bit more of a sense of substance of what was actually in the book rather than the marketing advertising text. So here's the bread and butter of it. Is it really slashery, right? The nightmare became reality. It was the bedroom door slamming that woke her. Fran jumped out of bed and stood clutching at her filmy nightgown. There was a loud laugh behind her, and fear shot down her stomach as she spun around, staring into the darkness. Slowly, Fran was able to make out the shadowy, huge figure leaning against the door. "What do you want?" she whispered. The man laughed again. "Look," he said, and quickly struck a match. He held the flame against the bright metal of a long, thick knife. "Now we play games." And the shadowy figure moved forward. Is there any way to cut it? This is a slasher novel. This is the most slashery slasher novel that ever slashed. And yet, it was never adapted to a film. It's virtually unknown, and no one talks about it in the community when they talk about those important stepping stones in the proto-slasher movement. We hear about things like Peeping Tom. We hear about some of the later William Castle films like Homicidal, right? But we don't hear about the slasher. Is it because it's a book? Well, if it is because it's a book, that's a real shame, because all the slasher goodies that you could possibly want are here. Yeah, it's a little bit more of a police procedural. Again, we're kind of reflecting that uneasy state of things between the life coverage of Ed Gein and the original newspaper articles about Jack the Ripper. It's all represented in there, and that's kind of the template they're going with. But everything you want in a good slasher is right here. The subgenre would obviously come to life with Black Christmas and Halloween. And then it would go into overdrive with the release of Sean Cunningham's Friday the 13th in 1980. You know, the deluge of films that came out between 1980 and 1985 is unthinkable. There's so many slasher films released in that period. And they range in quality from really very good to not very good at all. But the interesting thing is it really didn't seep into other media at that point. Even when all these films were popular, there weren't a lot of comic book slashers, and there wasn't a big wave of slasher books like there was in an earlier period to respond to Psycho. By the way, do you remember when I talked about my bio, how I said yellow-spined paperbacks? If you don't know why I have that as a description, well, the pulp novels of this entire era were always yellow on the spine. But nothing can last forever. And frankly, there was just a lot of fatigue. Even late in the decade, when something like Halloween 4 came out and did well, rejuvenating its brand, no one really wanted 24 copycats. And Hollywood got that message loud and clear. By 1991, there was really very little energy left in the industry to put anything else out. Even the supernatural slashers like Shocker or Horror Show, they had outlived their welcome as well. Ironically, I think Paramount Pictures is releasing a great experimental slasher called Body Parts. Got just steamrolled by the fact that no one wanted these things. I think that film has a lot going for it. Of course, Candyman's release gets lumped in with the slasher by many people, and that's not at all what that movie is. It's not why that movie works. It's not the structure of that movie. It's certainly not the meaning of that movie. But until Scream, we really don't get another big explosion in the slasher genre. And I'm going to posit a reason why. The truth is, Psycho both the novel and the film, begat a lot of imitators, but it proved a point, which is that the basic dramatic structure of the kind of Agatha Christie, and then there were none, I'll use the polite title, model was something you could strip down and it would always work. But if you stripped it down too far, it lost all reason to separate one film from another. We all grew up in families whereas, your mom or dad or uncle couldn't tell Michael Myers from Jason Voorhees, right? They referred to them interchangeably. Unfortunately, that's most people when we talk about this slasher explosion. But ask them who Norman Bates is, and they know. You can't quite do that with Black Christmas because, of course, we don't know for sure who that killer really was, right? We just know Billy, which Billy can be anyone. If Halloween and Friday the 13th, I guess, had spawned an entire industry upfront at the time of the slasher explosion, if there had been comic books, and if there had been board games, and if there had been novelty songs and everything else that Psycho enjoyed, I think that it would have leveled out the genre a bit, and it might have had a more lasting, enduring legacy immediately. And it wouldn't have taken going away for 10 years to be rejuvenated in what I consider to be pretty much a parody form. That's kind of what meta is on some true level. Instead, it would have just rode right through. Maybe not as many films as quickly, but there would have been more consistently good films to keep the genre rolling and keep it alive and vital. Today, we have slashers as far as the eye can see. The number of good ones we have is remarkably few. Now, there are good ones, though. Everyone knows my love for Hellfest, and I think Game Over, the Indian slasher film, is perhaps the finest example of the genre possible. Not just that exists, but it might be the finest version that can exist. Simply because it does some amazing, amazing things that you would not expect, but once you've seen the film, they all seem completely built in. And like they were always there. Anyway, I hope this little look at the slasher has at least tickled a little curiosity in you. The book is out there. It is on Kindle. I think you can even read it for free. Copies of the paperback are out there. Not even expensive. Most are in pretty good condition. Again, the book was in print for a while, so it's not ultra rare. Please don't pay like exorbitant prices for it. You shouldn't have to. But I think this is, for the hardcore slasher fan, the missing link. And I think it's a worthy addition to your library. Even if you don't collect books, maybe you want to slide it right between your Blu-ray of Psycho and Halloween, where it belongs. See you soon.